In February of the year 1258, a witness standing on the banks of the Tigris in the city of Baghdad described something that sounds like a nightmare. The great river was running in two colors, red along one current from blood, and black along another from ink. The ink came from books, tens of thousands of them, perhaps more, thrown into the water until, according to those who were there, the pages formed a kind of bridge, and the river itself took on the color of writing. A library the size of a civilization dissolving into a river. We should be careful here. Some of these images reach us through grief and through legend, and we will separate what we know from what we are told as we go. But strip away the poetry, and a hard fact remains. In a single week, the largest, richest, most learned city on earth was broken, and an empire of knowledge that had taken 500 years to build was gone. The people of Baghdad called their city the navel of the world, the center, round, deliberate, perfect. For half a millennium, it had been the place you went to learn how the universe worked. And then, in the winter of 1258, it stopped being the center of anything. What died in Baghdad that week was not only a city, and not only the hundreds of thousands of people who lived in it. Something less tangible died too. An idea. The idea that a single city could become the mind of the human race. This is the story of the week that idea was thrown into a river. To feel the size of the loss, you have to go back 500 years to the city's very first day. In the year 762, the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur stood on a stretch of ground beside the Tigris and ordered a capital built from nothing. Not a city that grew by accident over centuries, but a city designed. His architects laid it out as a perfect circle, with the Caliph's palace and the great mosque at the exact center, and the rest of the world arranged in rings around them. People called it the Round City, the City of Peace. The location was no accident. Baghdad sat where the Tigris and the Euphrates run close together, on the trade roads that connected the Mediterranean to India and China. Silk, spices, paper, ideas, everything moving between East and West passed through it. Within a few generations, it may have been the first city in human history to hold more than 1 million people. And the wealth that flowed in was not only spent on palaces, it was spent on something stranger and rarer. It was spent on knowledge. In most of the ancient world, knowledge was scarce on purpose. Books were copied by hand onto expensive materials, locked away, owned by the powerful. Baghdad broke that. The breakthrough was a technology that had traveled along the trade roads from China. Paper. Cheap, smooth, quick to produce. Baghdad built some of the first paper mills in the Islamic world, and suddenly a book no longer had to be a treasure for kings. It could be made by the hundred. Knowledge could spread, and so it did. Scholars in Baghdad and across the Abbasid world launched one of the greatest projects in the history of the mind. They set out to gather and translate the learning of every civilization they could reach. The philosophy and science of the Greeks, the mathematics of India, the astronomy of Persia. Texts that might otherwise have vanished forever were translated into Arabic, copied, argued over, and pushed further. This is the world that gave us the word algebra, that refined the numerals we still write today, that mapped the stars and described how blood moves through the body. By tradition, much of this centered on a great institution remembered as the House of Wisdom, though modern historians caution that the grand library of legend may loom larger in memory than it ever did in stone. Whatever its exact shape, the achievement was real. For 5 centuries, Baghdad was where the world came to think. That was what stood on the banks of the Tigris in 1258. Not a fortress, not a treasury, the accumulated memory of the human race. And it was about to meet an army that did not read. But the Baghdad of 1258 was not the Baghdad of its golden age. The light had been fading for a long time. The Abbasid Caliphs still carried the most prestigious title in the Islamic world. They were, in theory, the successors of the Prophet, the spiritual heart of a faith that stretched across 3 continents. But real power had been slipping away from them for centuries. Provinces had broken off. Soldiers and warlords had seized control of the government. By now, the caliph's actual authority barely reached beyond the city walls. On the throne sat al-Mustasim, the 37th Abbasid Caliph, and history has not been kind to him. He is remembered as a man who loved the comfort and ceremony of his office, but understood little of its danger, surrounded by advisors who flattered him, who quarreled with one another, and who could not agree on what to do as the worst threat in the city's history rode toward them. There is a darker thread in the old accounts, too. Stories that the caliph's own vizier, Ibn al-Alqami, secretly betrayed the city to the enemy. Those accusations are bitterly contested, and they carry an ugly sectarian charge that later writers used to assign blame, so we cannot treat them as settled fact. What is clear is simpler and sadder. The leadership of Baghdad, facing a threat to its very existence, was divided, complacent, and slow. They believed the city was protected by its walls, by its name, by God himself. They were about to learn that the army outside believed in none of those things. To understand what was coming, you have to go back to a man who was already a byword for terror: Genghis Khan. In a single generation, Genghis and his successors had built the largest connected land empire the world had ever seen, stretching from the Pacific toward the gates of Europe. The Mongol army was unlike anything the settled world knew how to fight. Fast, disciplined, brilliantly organized, and willing to erase entire cities that resisted them. By the 1250s, the empire was in the hands of Genghis's grandsons. One of them, the great Khan Monka, gave his brother Hulagu a mission: ride west and bring the lands of Islam under Mongol rule. Hulagu advanced like a slow, grinding machine. His first great target was a name that had frightened the region for over a century: the Order of the Assassins, hidden in their mountain fortress of Alamut. In 1256, the Mongols took it. The impregnable was no longer impregnable, and the lesson was not lost on anyone watching. If Alamut could fall, anything could. And the Mongols had learned a crucial trick. They had absorbed the engineers of the peoples they conquered, including Chinese siege experts. They no longer simply rode around walls. They knew how to bring them down. Next on the list was the greatest prize of all, the City of Peace. And Hulagu was already on the road. When Hulagu's demand reached Baghdad, it was simple: submit, tear down your walls, and acknowledge the Mongol Khan as your master. What followed was a catastrophe of pride. The Caliph al-Mustasim refused, but he refused without preparing. He did not raise a great army. He did not properly repair and man the walls. He did not buy time. By the accounts, he traded threats with Hulagu while doing almost nothing to back them up. In one story, the Caliph warns that if he is attacked, the whole Muslim world will rise to his defense, and the very order of the heavens will turn against the invaders. It was a fatal miscalculation, built on 2 false beliefs. The first was that Baghdad's walls and the Caliph's sacred status would be enough to hold the Mongols back. The second was that the wider Islamic world would come running to save its spiritual capital. Neither was true. The walls were strong, but the Mongols had broken stronger. And the rest of the Muslim world, fractured, exhausted, and frightened, did not come. Baghdad would face the storm alone. He thought his name was a shield, but a name does not stop a catapult. The Mongol army arrived in January 1258, and it did not come as a mob. It came as a science. Hulagu's forces split and surrounded the city completely, sealing it off, not just the approaches by land, but the river itself. When some of the defenders tried to break out, they were crushed in the open. There would be no escape down the Tigris. Then the engineers went to work. They raised siege lines and platforms and brought their machines to bear on the walls. Stone and fire rained down. Because the flat plains around Baghdad held few large rocks, the Mongols are said to have hauled ammunition in from far away and to have torn apart whatever they could find to feed the catapults. Within days, the eastern wall began to break. By the start of February, the Mongols held the top of it. The greatest city in the world had been cracked open, and a terrified population understood that the thing they had believed impossible was happening in front of them. The Caliph, who had refused to bargain from strength, now tried to bargain from ruin. He sent out offers. He sent out his own sons. It was far too late. On the 10th of February, 1258, the gates opened, and Al-Mustasim walked out to surrender. Behind him, he left the richest city on earth. Ahead of him lay nothing but the mercy of a man who had come to make an example. What happened next is one of the darkest weeks in the history of cities, and it deserves to be told plainly, without spectacle. The Mongols entered Baghdad and, over roughly a week, destroyed it. Mosques, palaces, hospitals, homes. The population was put to the sword on a scale that staggered everyone who later tried to describe it. Modern historians estimate the dead at somewhere between 200,000 and 1 million people. The truth is that we will never know the real number. The figures that come down to us were written by grieving survivors and by boasting conquerors, and both had reasons to reach for the largest number they could imagine. But behind every estimate, however uncertain, lies the same unbearable fact. A living city of human beings, scholars and children and craftsmen, the old and the ordinary, was largely wiped out in a matter of days. The smell of it, the chroniclers wrote, eventually drove the Mongols themselves to move their camp upwind. We do not need an exact number to understand what was lost. The number was a world. And in the middle of that week, alongside the people, something else was being destroyed. The reason Baghdad had ever mattered at all. The libraries of Baghdad were among the greatest collections ever assembled by human hands. Centuries of mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, poetry, and law. Much of it gathered nowhere else on earth, some of it surviving in single, irreplaceable copies. In the sack, they were destroyed. Books were burned, books were trampled, and in the image that has echoed for 800 years, books were thrown into the Tigris in such numbers that the survivors said the river ran black with their ink. We should hold that image carefully. It is partly the language of mourning, and the true scale of what those libraries held is something historians still debate. But even the most cautious version is a tragedy almost beyond measure. Knowledge that had taken 500 years and a dozen civilizations to gather was scattered and drowned in a single week. Some of it, we know, was lost forever. Texts we only know existed because other writers once quoted them, and the men and women who carried that knowledge died with it. The scholars of Baghdad were killed or scattered to the winds. Then came the death of the Caliph himself. By the most famous account, the Mongols would not spill royal blood on the ground, so Al-Mustasim was wrapped in a carpet and trampled beneath their horses. The last Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad, crushed inside a rug while his city burned. Some sources tell it differently, saying he was starved to death instead. But every version ends the same way. After 500 years, the line went silent. They threw the memory of the world into a river, and for a moment it must have seemed as though the river had won. Hulagu did not stop at Baghdad. The storm rolled on. Within 2 years, his armies pushed west into Syria, and the great cities of Aleppo and Damascus fell in their turn in 1260. The Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad, the institution that had stood at the symbolic center of the Islamic world for half a millennium, was simply gone. In its place rose a new Mongol state, the Ilkhanate, ruling the lands of Iran and Iraq. By the old story, this is where the golden age of Islamic learning ends. The lights go out and the world goes dark. But the truth is more complicated and a little more hopeful. Knowledge is harder to kill than a city. Even in the middle of the destruction, a great Persian scholar named Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, who had attached himself to Hulagu, managed to save thousands of manuscripts and have them carried to a new observatory at Maraha, where science continued under the very conquerors who had burned its old home. And the ideas of Baghdad had already spread outward for centuries, to Cairo, to Cordoba, to 100 other cities. The river took the books of Baghdad. It did not take the knowledge of the world. Still, by 1260, the Mongols must have looked unstoppable. Every great power in their path had fallen. The empires of the East, gone. The Caliphate, gone. The cities of Syria, gone. There seemed to be no one left who could stand in front of the storm. Every door had been broken. Except one, far to the southwest, in Egypt. To understand why the Mongols were finally stopped, you have to meet some of the strangest rulers of the medieval world. Because in 1258, Egypt was governed by men who had begun their lives as slaves. They were called the Mamluks. As boys, they had been bought far away, many of them from the same steppes the Mongols came from, brought to Egypt, converted to Islam, and raised as elite soldiers. They were trained to be a perfect fighting machine, loyal to their masters. And then, just a few years before Baghdad fell, they had done something no one expected. They overthrew the dynasty they served and took Egypt for themselves. Slave soldiers had become sultans. Their new state was young and looked fragile, but it was led by hard, brilliant men. The Sultan Qutuz, who, in a strange turn of fate, had himself been enslaved during an earlier Mongol conquest. And beside him, a commander whose name would become legend, Baybars. When Hulagu's envoys arrived in Cairo, carrying the same demand that had been delivered to Baghdad, submit or be destroyed, Qutuz gave the answer the Caliph never dared. He had the envoys executed. There would be no surrender, and now there was no way back. Now several things came together at once. Far to the east, the great Khan Monk died, and Hulagu marched the bulk of his army back toward the Mongol heartland to take part in the struggle over the succession, leaving a strong but reduced force behind in Syria under one of his commanders. That mattered, but it would be a mistake to treat it as the whole story, the way it is sometimes told. The Mongol army that stayed was still large, battle-hardened, and led by an experienced general, and on paper it should have been more than enough to crush anything in front of it. What met it was not an accident of timing, It was an army. The Mamluks were among the finest heavy cavalry in the world, professional soldiers who had trained for war their whole lives, and they marched out of Egypt under commanders who understood exactly how the Mongols fought and how they could be beaten. The withdrawal opened the door. It was the Egyptian army that walked through it and won. In the year 1260, at a place called Ain Jalut, the army that had drowned Baghdad met an army that refused to run. And for the first time, the Mongols were beaten in a pitched battle. How the soldiers of Egypt did what no power before them had managed, that is a story for another episode. The Tigris washed the ink away a long time ago. The water runs clear now. Stand on its banks in Baghdad today, and you would never know. And maybe that is the hardest part of the whole story. Not that it happened, but how completely it could be erased. A city that had been the center of the world for 500 years. The place where humanity kept much of its memory could be unmade in a single week. And the river that carried off its books would simply move on, as if none of it had ever been there. We are still arguing about the details. How many truly died? How large the great libraries really were? How much of the Black River is history, and how much is grief turned into poetry? Those debates matter, and we should be honest that we do not have every answer. But the core of it is not in doubt. Once, human beings built a city whose greatest treasure was not its gold, but its knowledge. And they lost it, almost completely, in a handful of days. It is the oldest warning there is about how fragile a civilization's memory can be. And yet, here we are, 800 years later, still telling it. The knowledge of Baghdad did not all die in that water. It had already escaped into other cities, other languages, other minds. And the world it helped build did not end on the banks of the Tigris. The river washed the ink away, but the story that ink was carrying, we are still telling. And the next chapter of it began far away, in Egypt.